Well, good morning. It's good to see you. Welcome. Happy Father's Day to all you ladies, and happy Father's Day online. It's good to have you with us, and I hope you dads are being spoiled. Come to think of it, that's par for the course. You don't have to wait till Father's Day. I'm spoiled every day of the week, and I love it. Now, today, I would like to talk about part of the father's life, part of all of our life, but apply it particularly to fathers, and that is this, that we are not here this morning, or anywhere, as a matter of fact, by chance. It doesn't just happen by accident that we are where we are. Many times we're saying, I wish I was that, or I wish I wasn't here, or I wish I was... But the truth is that what I'd like to do this morning is start with God's control over the larger things of the universe. I'd like to bring it down to God's control of the nations. And then just before we leave, I want us to look at the fact that God actually has control in our life. So let's start that journey. And I was looking at a book for talking to new believers in how do you find Christ, how do you come to Christ, and what is necessary for you to know. And the journey in this piece of work was actually very much like the journey that I had to take in order to find Jesus Christ myself. And you've heard my journey. I had a business. I was sitting in the front window, and I was watching a truck go by, and truck after truck after truck was moving tons of dirt. There was a construction site at the end of the street. And I'm sitting there, and I'm wondering, how much dirt do they have to move from one place to another before they make the world wobble? And then I got thinking, well, how much does the world weigh? How much would you have to move? And as I'm sitting there, then I'm thinking about the size of the earth, the weight of the earth, and then I'm thinking about our whole solar system. And then because my brain goes all over the place, it started to think about how much our whole solar system weighed, and then how many solar systems were there. And it's not very long before you realize there's a lot of stuff out there. And finally, I accidentally came to the thought, wait a minute, there's too much stuff out there. Where did this stuff come from? And I wasn't looking for God, and I wasn't interested in God. In fact, coming to God would mess up my life big time. But there I was, stuck in the front window of my business, realizing that somewhere out there, somebody put this stuff there because you can't have something from nothing. And there's a truckload of stuff out there. And I wanted, as I worked through this material with a new believers class, now I need to tell you this. I was warned a long time ago by the staff who work for me that when I hit a message that I just love, you're going to hate it, okay? So here we go. I really enjoyed working through this stuff. And as we go through it, what happens is if you do not accept the information as proffered in the owner's manual, then the alternatives take you to really crazy places. If you come up with alternate explanations for how we got here. Now let's look at some of the things that kind of blew my mind until finally I had to say, unfortunately, I think there's a God out there. And here I started with our own solar system. Why is it called solar? It comes from the Latin sol, meaning sun. So our solar system revolves around the sun, so we call it our solar system. And our solar system lives in a galaxy called the Milky Way. And the Milky Way has these arms reaching out of it, and we are about 2/3 of the way out one arm, and this whole Milky Way is spinning at about 515,000 miles an hour. And as it goes around at that speed, about once every 230 million years, it will do a complete cycle. Now, the thing that was bothering me was, that's one galaxy, and in our Milky Way, there's like 100 billion stars, and each star has a planet or two or six. So we're looking at 400 to 600 billion entities in our galaxy system, and then there are hundreds of billions of galaxies. And I'm going, this stuff is nuts. This is nuts. There's just too much stuff to have happened accidentally. So I couldn't imagine, I sort of lost my own brain in this. Our own galaxy, this galaxy, is 100 light years across. How big is 100,000 light years? Well, light is what it'll travel in a year. So light for 1 second travels 186,000 miles, 1 second. In a minute, 11,100,000 miles. The Earth is 8 minutes away in light years. In a day, it goes 16 billion miles. And we're still nowhere, but in a year, 1 light year, 5.8 trillion miles a year. Now, inside the galaxy, the nearest star to us is 4.25 light years. There's 100 light years, which is 588 trillion miles. 100,000 light years is 588 quadrillion. So what am I saying? Somebody is pretty big up there. Something's going on which blows the mind. Our little galaxy, which is not the largest one, but one of 100 billion or so, is huge. And I stumbled over this. I was quite happy not believing in God. And so this stuff started to wear away at me. Now, in all of this universe, how come we are here with life on it, and we're having real difficulty finding any place else in these hundreds of trillions of billions of planets? Where else would there be life? And why is it that we have the perfect atmosphere here to sustain life, which we can't find anywhere else? Well, there's a couple factors that come into it. One of it is we live on a stable planet. Once every 41,000 years, our planet will only move about 2.5 degrees, and it stays on that. Any more than that, and it destroys everything. Mars moves 10 times that amount, and it just destroys life and everything else on it. Why do we stay in this orbit? We stay in this orbit because somebody placed a huge moon exactly the right distance and the right mass where the gravitational pull holds everything where that it should be. And we start to look at this little place we live, and we find we're exactly the right distance from the sun. We're exactly the right distance from the moon. We have all of the weaker and stronger nuclear forces are just exactly right to hold the atomic structures together so they don't blow apart. Gravity is just perfectly correct so that the atmosphere doesn't fly off or that it's so heavy that it crushes us. Gravity is just exactly right so that we stay in the orbit around the sun, the moon stays in orbit around us. And we did this a few years ago, and the number of parameters that have to be perfect within infinitesimal percentage points, it just goes on. They started to have to make new numbers. What's the probability of this? What's the probability of that? What's the probability of all of this stuff? And then you put it together, and finally, you have a real problem, because it cannot have happened through a random process. Entropy is what happens through randomness, not order, if you're tracking with me. So they come up with a number called a Google number, and they had to come up with whole new numbers. The probability is 10 to this, and it's like the common sense equivalent is, if your neighbor wins 5 lottery tickets in a row, they would quit paying him off, okay? Why? It can't happen. The probabilities are too large. In fact, the probability of winning one is large. My dad used to say that buying a lottery ticket is not a gamble. In order for it to be a gamble, there has to be the possibility of winning. So, and by the way, statistically, your chances of winning are roughly what they were before you bought the ticket, after you buy the ticket. But anyways, that's another thing. So our common sense tells us your neighbor doesn't win lottery ticket after lottery ticket after lottery ticket. Why? He's cheating. He's messing with the system. He's got an E. He's moving stuff around to make that outcome happen. So when we go to the universe and the probabilities are unbelievably exponentially large than a lottery ticket, if your common sense kicks in, you're saying, this can't happen. Somebody's messing with the system. And that's where I had to stop and reorder my life. And I didn't come to God through Jesus Christ and all the rest of the stuff. I went, why? Because I'm cynical and I don't believe anybody about anything, and I have to learn for myself. And yes, I had to learn everything the hard way. You don't tell me, don't put your hand on the stove. The next thing you're going to be doing is wrapping the burn on my hand from the stove. But as I worked my way through this, God made it obvious that He's there. Now, in light of that stuff, read with me this verse from Romans. Have you got it? The verse in red in your bulletin? Let's do something weird. Read this with me, would you? Let's read it out loud. Read it out so loud that you wake up your wife sitting next to you there. Just blat it out. All right. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see His invisible qualities, His eternal power, and divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God. What's he saying? He's saying if you apply the same logic that you do to a lottery ticket, you will have to acknowledge somebody is messing with the system. Somebody put everything there in those proportions, and all of a sudden, oh, shoot, there is a God. Now what? And that began my journey. Now, just so that you think that it's that simple, that's only 5% of the universe. 95% of it is dark matter and dark energy. We don't even know what it is. We just know it's there mathematically. So all that stuff we just talked about represents about 5%. You see what I'm saying? if you are intellectually honest, you have to do some leaps in logic to come up with alternative explanations for how we are, why we are. Now, people who don't, Francis Collins, you remember when President Clinton was the president, and he won the Nobel Prize, and Francis Crick, I think both of them won the prize, Nobel Prize, for their work with the DNA molecule. Now, the problem with the DNA molecule is the same as the problem with the whole universe. If you don't put into the equation somebody's messing with it, it doesn't work out. By that I mean, if you look at when they believe the Earth began until now, and you look at the complexity of the DNA molecule, Francis Collins calls it the fingerprint or the language of God. It's so complex, so well written, so ordered, and it has so many rules of writing that he said, look, this is not random. Somebody wrote this DNA molecule, and he said, there's a God. Now, Francis Crick, who was working on the same problem, said, well, I don't really want to believe in God. I believe aliens came from another planet and deposited life on Earth and started this whole process. I'm saying that if you don't want to believe in God, what you do have to believe in is harder to believe than God. And if aliens did come from another planet and deposit life on Earth, now you have to explain how they got there. This doesn't solve anything. And whether you run parallel universes, all that does is make this whole thing exponentially more complex because it has to happen 10 or 11 or 13 times. And you still have the problem of all of that stuff came from nothing. And that doesn't count the 95% you can't see, dark energy and dark matter. So the problems of not allowing God into our understanding of life can't really be done, for me anyways, without being intellectually dishonest. I was looking at, scientists are brilliant men. Michio Kaku is writing a book called The God Equation, and basically they're trying to, he's a string theorist, they're trying to figure out how the universe got here. How did this thing happen? The theory of everything. And you have Neil Tyson, what's the name? deGrasse, yes. Neil deGrasse Tyson. And he had 11 scientists on. I watched them for 2 hours as they were talking about the different scientists, how something came from nothing. They were going to explain it. I watched for 2 hours. They didn't explain anything. And I was watching Stephen Hawking. He had a lecture called How Something Came from Nothing. And I watched that. And basically what he said was, you have a huge mass of negative energy and a huge mass of positive energy, and that, in essence, is nothing. Stephen, you're a sharp guy. But two huge masses is not nothing. It's two huge masses. How did you get something from nothing? I called my daughter in, and I said, watch this, and tell me what he just said. What he said was, you start with something. Yeah, and that's the problem. God created everything that we see, and then he said there's enough evidence there that there's no excuse for not finding God. You tracking with me? And that's how I accidentally had to acknowledge there was a God. And then I looked at all the religions. I started with the youth groups where the girls were first, and then I looked around to churches and stuff like that and started to trace my way through until I found Jesus Christ. Now, here, God is, for me, obviously, the architect of the universe. Paul is talking about God's hand on the earth, and he's waiting for some guys to show up. I think he's in Athens or somewhere. And he explains to them, this is the talk he had on the unknown God. He had hundreds of gods, and then just in case they missed one, they built a statue to an unknown God so that if they did, he wouldn't be offended. And he begins to explain to them Jehovah God. And he says, and this is in your bulletin as well on the front page, Acts 27. He is the God. He says, this unknown God that you haven't found yet, he is the God who made the world and everything in it. Since he is the Lord of heaven and earth, he doesn't live in man-made temples, and human hands can't serve his needs, for he has no needs. He himself gives life and breath and everything. He satisfies every need. What does that mean? That means we got 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, we got some xenon, we got some other stuff, exactly what we need. Everything that we need is provided here. And then he goes on and he says, from one man, he created all the nations throughout the earth. What he's saying is, God moves the political. You gave me that article on don't call it just politics. He started with one man, and he moved the nations, rose up, tore down, and then he says he placed them where they should be. Now, the extension of this is he places people where they should be when they should be there. This is God. He can create big things, he can run nations, and he comes down into your life. He decided beforehand when they should rise, when they should fall, and he determined their boundaries. His purpose for all this was so that they could find God. The universe is there. There's enough evidence to point to God. He's moving nations around, and as you watch the geopolitical nature of the world, it doesn't make sense unless you have good and evil and God. And so here, now, fathers, we're into the part where, so what's that got to do with me? Well, Dad, let me tell you. I'm glad you asked. And if you hadn't asked, the sermon would be over. So glad you asked. Nobody asked. We want to go home. All right. When it comes to us personally, he starts, and it says that in the first place, he formed a man from the dust of the ground, and he breathed life into him. And then he placed the man he had formed where he wanted him in that garden and in that place. Now, what does that mean? That means that we are in a relationship with our Creator. And God is looking down, and he's watching the behavior of the people. He says, you foolish people, what do you do? I'm the Creator. You need to live in a relationship to me, acknowledging that I'm the Creator, you have been created by me. And in this relationship we have with the Creator, Paul is writing to the churches scattered throughout Rome, and this is when Nero was the emperor, and there was churches all over the place, and so he writes, he says, and this is in your bulletin as well, I think. Yes, it's on the inside, Romans 9. But who are you, a human being, to talk back to God? Shall what is formed say to the one who formed it, why did you make me like this? In other words, why did he make me 5'8" instead of 6'8"? And we argue with God, I want this, I want that. And we are not content with what God has given to us, and we object and rebel. This is like, if you've raised a child, they often hit a stage where they are smarter than you. And you are quite dumb. And they know best. And they strike out on their own because you're too dumba with a capital B. In this scripture verse, Paul is saying to the Romans, be careful because God has wisdom and you are his creation, and you should be following the direction and wisdom that comes from that source. And then he goes on, what is it that God is doing with us? Why are we here? Now, I need to tell you that if you got here through a random process, of evolution, and pop, here you are, and then someone says, why are you here? What do you mean, why am I here? I'm just here. You can make up any rule you want. Why? You just sort of got there. But for the man who acknowledges God, we find out there's a purpose for his life, there's a reason for his existence, there's a life mission that he has been granted, and life makes sense. So here, Paul is saying, I'm in pain until Christ is formed in you. We are to be men, and everybody, but men, we are to be transforming into the likeness of Jesus Christ. I know some of you, and you've transformed into the likeness of the Antichrist, but the purpose is to become like Jesus Christ and to be as serving as he did, as loving as he did, and as harmless as a but wise at the same time. We are to be becoming like Jesus. How do we do this? Well, Paul is still talking to the churches around Rome, and he says, so here's what I want you to do. God helping you, take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life. Place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for him. Basically, we stay in relationship to God. And we say, okay, what are we doing today? My life is yours. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God, and you'll be changed from the inside out. We, as men and people, but as men, are to be in the process of being transformed from the inside out. One of the problems of religion in general is they want the outer symptoms of goodness, but they don't have the transformation from the inside out. They have a set of behaviors which make you look good, but the heart still remains as it was. But as we walk with God, the purpose of that is to transform us from the inside until we become like Jesus Christ, the head of the church, the Savior of this world, and then we can be and accept the purposes of God for our life. Readily recognize what he wants from you and quickly respond to it, unlike the culture around you, which is always dragging you down to its level of immaturity. God brings out the best of you, develops well-informed maturity in you. The Army had that slogan a while ago, be all that you can be. Men, it is in God and his purpose and knowing how he created us and for what he created us that we become all we can be. The person who is a self-made man has a very small God. But the person who's made in the image of God and then remade into the image of Jesus Christ walks with the creator of the universe that we just looked at. That's a big God, and he wants to live and guide you. He wants to live in you and guide your life. And then Paul says, not only does he want to do that, respond quickly to his leading and his guiding. As a Christian man, you are not to be dragged down to the level of immaturity of this culture, but rather you are to allow God to elevate you. What we said last week was you either become better or you become bitter. In a time of social crisis, it should be the Church of Jesus Christ that rises above and provides stability and hope for the world. We need to have the conviction that God is in control and nothing's going to happen that he won't allow. If he's calling an end to time, that's what's going to happen. If he's saying it's time for our nation to fall, our nation will fall. If he says it's time for our nation to rise and become even more dominant than it is, that's what will happen. God is in charge, and we need to walk the face of the earth with a quiet, powerful confidence that nothing formed against us can succeed. We are children of the living, eternal God, and He lives in us, and there is nothing that can defeat us because we are children of God. We should be the ones who bring stability, peace, and hope in turmoil on the earth. And this thing that we have just been through, if we ever go through it again, and we will, we need to know the world needs the church. And I would like to see the church take even a more positive stance. We've been talking about the fact the church got sucked in to the discussion of the world. And I would say, don't let it drag you down to their level of immaturity. You with me? Our thoughts are God's thoughts. They are in a different level and on a different kingdom and with a different power and with a different governance than anything that is here. And when the earth goes into turmoil, we stay on course, building the kingdom of God through Jesus Christ. We are immovable, unshakable, and focused and have direction, and men who allow God to reform them are living the life that they should live. And they are living what Jesus called the abundant life. That's the larger picture. And why do we do all this? 2 Corinthians 9, God can pour out a blessing in astonishing ways that you're ready for anything and everything. And more than just ready to do what needs to be done, as one psalmist puts it, he throws caution to the wind, giving to the needy with reckless abandon. It goes on. That's the introduction, but I'm out of time. Men, it is finding your place in God through Jesus Christ that you can be who you were meant to be. And remember, Jesus Christ said, as men, we sometimes use our power to, the tendency is to have people serve us. The boss doesn't have to do this or have to do that. No. Jesus Christ said, I'm the King of Kings. I'm the Lord of Lords. I am the entity through which your Father created the universe. I am the power that holds things together. In me, all things live and move and have their being. I am the glue that holds this together. Sit down and let me wash your feet. There's a humility. There's a service that changes the world. The only way to overcome the Roman Empire was the values of Jesus Christ. And they have persisted for 2,000 years. And so, men, as you become like Christ, you will live a life that will persist generation to generation to generation. I was fortunate. I had a great dad, and he's imprinted on me. In fact, good or bad, I look exactly like him. But anyways, his character comes down generation after generation after generation. Does that make sense? The man of God sets the bar for the generations that follow. So, gentlemen, your legacy goes on. Let it be a legacy of being all you can be because you allowed God to transform you from the inside